Melissa stared out the window of her favorite cafe, watching as raindrops slid down the glass, blurring the city lights outside. She had always loved this time of year, the cool autumn air and the sense of reflection it brought. After a long and tiring day at the office, this was her moment of peace. The familiar hum of the cafe, the soft clinks of cups, the murmur of conversations, the gentle background music was a soothing comfort. As she sipped her latte, Melissa noticed a figure standing near the door. The man was in his mid-40s, his clothes disheveled and worn, a large coat hanging loosely from his thin frame. His hair was tangled, and there was an air of exhaustion around him. Despite the cafe being almost full, no one seemed to notice him. The sight of him standing there, almost invisible to the world, tugged at something inside her. She didn't know why she did it. Perhaps it was the way his eyes, though downcast, reflected a quiet dignity. Or maybe she was just tired of seeing people walk past one another without a second glance. Whatever it was, before she could talk herself out of it, Melissa caught his gaze and waved him over. "Would you like to sit?" she asked, her voice kind but unsure of how he would respond. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering with surprise. He looked around the cafe as if searching for someone else she might have been speaking to, but there was no one. Slowly, cautiously, he approached and took the seat across from her. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't spoken much lately. "Melissa," she offered, extending her hand with a friendly smile. The man stared at her hand for a brief moment before lightly shaking it. His grip was gentle, almost hesitant, as though he wasn't used to physical contact. "Alex," he replied simply. Melissa smiled again, noticing how he carefully avoided her gaze, keeping his eyes on the table. "Are you hungry? I can get you something to eat," she asked, trying to make him feel comfortable. He shook his head. "I don't want to bother you. I'll be fine." "It's no bother, really. I'd feel better knowing you've had something warm," she insisted. After a pause, he gave a small nod. Melissa signaled for the waiter and ordered a sandwich and tea for him. As they waited for the food, the silence between them was heavy, though not uncomfortable. Melissa could sense that Alex wasn't used to talking to people, and she didn't want to push him. "Rough day?" she asked softly, hoping to break the silence. Alex gave a slight nod, his lips curving in what looked like a sad smile. "You could say that." Melissa glanced out the window before speaking again. "This weather doesn't help, does it? Feels like the whole world gets a little heavier with the rain." Alex looked up at her for the first time since he sat down, his gaze meeting hers. There was something deep and unreadable in his eyes, like he was searching for something in her face. "It's not the weather," he said softly. "It's everything else." His words hung in the air for a moment, and Melissa felt a pang of empathy for this stranger sitting across from her. There was a weight to his voice, the kind that only comes from someone who's been through things most people couldn't imagine. She didn't pry, didn't ask for details. Something told her he wouldn't be ready to share, at least not yet. Their conversation ebbed and flowed with moments of quiet understanding. Melissa talked about her job, her love for this cafe, and how she often came here to clear her mind after a long day. Alex listened quietly, occasionally nodding, but rarely offering more than a word or two in response. When the food arrived, Alex ate slowly, almost as if he didn't want to rush through the meal. It was clear that he hadn't had something decent to eat in a while. Melissa sipped her tea, feeling a strange sense of peace in the simple act of sharing a meal with someone who needed it. "You didn't have to do this," Alex finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was a little stronger now, though still soft. Melissa shrugged lightly, offering him a gentle smile. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded that someone cares. It's nothing big." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's not nothing. People don't usually see me. They just walk past." Melissa felt a lump form in her throat at the sadness in his words. "Well, I see you," she replied quietly. Alex's eyes softened, and for the first time, Melissa saw a hint of warmth in them. He didn't say anything more, but the look they shared was enough. There was a quiet understanding between them, as if in that moment, words weren't necessary. As the night wore on, the cafe began to empty, and the rain outside turned into a steady drizzle. Melissa glanced at her watch and realized it was getting late. She had enjoyed their time together more than she expected, and she didn't regret inviting him to sit with her. But just as she was about to suggest they both head out, Alex reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He slid it across the table toward her, his hand trembling slightly. "Read this when I'm gone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Melissa could respond, Alex stood up and without another word, left the cafe, disappearing into the night. She stared at the note, her heart pounding in her chest. What could he possibly have written? Why had he seemed so nervous? With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper and began to read. Melissa watched Alex carefully as he picked up the steaming cup of tea she had ordered for him. His hands were rough, weathered, and a bit shaky as he lifted the cup to his lips. The silence between them was thick but not uncomfortable, filled with an unspoken tension that neither of them seemed ready to break. Melissa hesitated, not wanting to push him into talking, but her curiosity gnawed at her. Who was this man, and how had he ended up here, alone and seemingly forgotten by the world? She had a million questions, but she knew asking them all at once wouldn't get her any answers. "So have you been in the city long?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. Alex glanced up briefly before lowering his eyes back to the table, as if contemplating whether or not to answer. After a pause, he finally spoke. "A while," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He took another sip of tea, seemingly lost in thought. Melissa nodded, sensing his reluctance but wanting to keep the conversation going. "It must be tough sometimes, especially when the weather turns cold like this," she added, watching him carefully for any sign that he might open up. He shrugged, a non-committal gesture. "You get used to it after a while," he said, though the wariness in his voice suggested otherwise. Melissa tried a different approach, her tone lightening as she asked, "What's your favorite thing about the city? I mean, there's got to be something, right? The parks, the food, the skyline at night?" For the first time, a faint smile tugged at the corners of Alex's lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "The skyline," he admitted. "At night, when the city lights up, it's almost like everything's okay for a moment, like nothing's broken." Melissa smiled, encouraged by his response. "I get that. There's something calming about the way the city glows at night. It feels like there's still some magic left in the world." Alex nodded, but his expression darkened slightly as he muttered, "Magic? It's in short supply these days." The weight of his words hung between them, thick with meaning. Melissa felt an ache in her chest, the kind that came from knowing someone had experienced more hardship than they let on. "Do you have family here?" Melissa asked quietly, unsure if she was crossing a line, but feeling compelled to ask. Alex stiffened slightly, his fingers tightening around the cup. "Not anymore," he said flatly, his voice clipped, signaling that this was a topic he wasn't ready to dive into. Sensing the change in his mood, Melissa quickly shifted gears. "You know, I used to think I could handle everything on my own," she said, offering a small smile to soften the mood. "I thought if I worked hard enough and kept pushing forward, everything would fall into place. But life, it doesn't always work out like that, does it?" Alex's eyes flickered with recognition, and he set his cup down carefully. "No, it doesn't," he said quietly. There was a heaviness in his tone, as if he carried the weight of that truth with him every day. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, things just fall apart. Melissa leaned forward, her voice softening. "But that's why it's important to let people in, don't you think? So you don't have to carry it all by yourself." He looked up at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, Melissa could see the depth of pain in his eyes. There was a lifetime of struggle written in his expression, loss, regret, and a wariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "It's not that simple," Alex said, his voice barely audible. "People don't always want to help. And when they do, sometimes it just makes things worse." Melissa's heart sank at his words. She wanted to argue, to tell him that wasn't true, that there were good people in the world who cared, who wanted to make a difference. But she could see that Alex had been hurt too many times to believe that. He had built walls around himself, walls that wouldn't be easily taken down. "I'm not like most people," she said quietly, meeting his gaze with a steady determination. "I don't expect anything from you. I'm just here, sharing a cup of tea and offering a little kindness. Sometimes that's all we can give each other." Alex studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe her. Finally, he nodded slowly, a small but significant gesture of trust. Maybe, he said softly. Maybe you're right. The conversation drifted into quieter topics after that. Melissa spoke about her job, her daily routine, and how she often came to this cafe when she needed a break from the hectic pace of the city. Alex listened quietly, occasionally nodding or offering short responses, but for the most part, he remained a man of few words. Still, there was a shift in the air between them, a subtle change. The walls Alex had built weren't completely down, but a small crack had formed, allowing just a little light to shine through. And Melissa was content with that for now. As the minutes ticked by, Melissa glanced at her phone and realized how much time had passed. It was getting late, and the cafe was beginning to empty. She looked back at Alex, unsure of how to end the evening. It felt like there was so much more to say, but she didn't want to overstay her welcome. "You can come here anytime, you know?" Melissa said softly, breaking the silence. "Even if it's just for a cup of tea. You don't have to go through things alone." Alex didn't respond right away, but there was a faint glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks," he said quietly, and though the word was simple, it felt like it carried the weight of something much larger. Melissa smiled and stood up to leave, gathering her things. "Take care of yourself, Alex. I hope things get better." He gave a small nod, but as she walked away, she couldn't help but feel like there was something unresolved between them. Something more that he wanted to say, but couldn't quite bring himself to voice. And then, just as she reached the door, Alex called out softly, "Melissa?" She turned around, surprised to hear him say her name. "Thanks," he said again, this time with a sincerity that cut through the quiet of the cafe. His gaze held hers for a moment before he looked away, but in that brief exchange, Melissa knew she had made a difference, even if only a small one. The night air outside the cafe had grown colder, and Melissa glanced at the clock on the wall, realizing how late it had gotten. The cafe was nearly empty now, with just a few remaining patrons, and the warm hum of conversation had quieted down to a soft murmur. The rain continued to tap gently against the windows, as if echoing the quiet mood inside. Alex had grown more silent in the past few minutes, staring into his now empty cup of tea, his thoughts seemingly far away. Melissa wasn't sure what else to say. She didn't want to press him further, but she could tell that something was weighing heavily on his mind. It had been a strange evening, quiet but charged with unspoken emotions. She cleared her throat softly, breaking the silence. "It's getting late," she said, her tone gentle. "I should probably head out soon." Alex didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at the table, his hands resting loosely in his lap. Then, almost as if coming to a decision, he reached into the inside pocket of his worn-out coat. Melissa watched him, her curiosity piqued as he pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers playing nervously with the edges of the note, and then slid it across the table toward her. His hands trembled slightly as he did so. "Read it when I'm gone," Alex said quietly, his voice so low that Melissa had to strain to hear him. She blinked, staring at the paper, then back at Alex. "What is this?" she asked, confusion written on her face. Alex didn't meet her eyes. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Just read it later," he repeated, his voice firmer this time, though there was an edge of something else there, something like fear. Melissa instinctively reached out to stop him, her hand hovering in the air for a moment before she pulled it back, unsure of what to do. "Wait, Alex, what's going on? You don't have to leave like this," she urged, her voice soft but concerned. Alex shook his head, still avoiding her gaze. "I've already stayed too long," he murmured. "I shouldn't have. I can't explain right now." "But why the note?" she pressed gently, her brows furrowing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "If there's something you want to say, you can tell me." For a moment, Alex seemed conflicted, as if he was fighting with himself. His lips parted as though he was about to say something more, but then he stopped. He glanced at the door, his shoulders slumped slightly as if weighed down by an invisible burden. "I'm sorry," he whispered, turning away from her. Before Melissa could say anything else, Alex walked swiftly out of the cafe, disappearing into the rainy night. The bell over the door chimed softly as he left, but the sound felt distant, like an echo from another world. Melissa sat there in stunned silence, staring down at the crumpled note on the table. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm quickening as a sense of unease settled over her. What had just happened? Why did Alex seem so desperate to leave? And more importantly, what could possibly be written on that piece of paper? She hesitated, staring at the note for a long moment before slowly reaching for it. Her fingers brushed against the worn edges, and she felt a strange surge of anxiety as she unfolded the paper, revealing the scribbled writing inside. The words, scrawled in hurried, almost shaky handwriting, made her breath catch in her throat. "You're one of the few who saw me as a person. I'm not who I seem to be, but I can't explain more now. Your kindness won't go unnoticed. Tomorrow, your life will change. Don't be afraid. I believe in you. Alex." Melissa read the note once, then twice, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The words seemed to blur together as her thoughts raced. Not who he seems to be. Her kindness would change her life? It was as if she had stumbled into some kind of mystery without even realizing it. She slumped back in her chair, staring at the note in disbelief. Alex had seemed so ordinary, so quiet and broken by life, but now this. What did he mean by all of this? Her mind ran wild with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Was it some sort of cryptic message? A warning? Or was he just delusional? She let out a slow, shaky breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The rain outside continued to fall, the soft patter against the windows now a comforting backdrop to the storm of questions swirling in her mind. She had only known Alex for a few hours, but somehow, those few hours felt like the beginning of something much bigger than she could have imagined. Glancing down at the note again, Melissa felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. Tomorrow, her life would change. But how? And why? And what could Alex possibly have meant by "I'm not who I seem to be"? Melissa folded the note carefully and slipped it into her bag, her mind still buzzing with questions. She stood up from the table, feeling an odd sense of anticipation and dread filling her chest. As she made her way out of the cafe and into the cold night air, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something far beyond her understanding. Whatever tomorrow brought, she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. The following morning, Melissa woke up with a strange mix of excitement and anxiety swirling in her chest. The memory of Alex and the cryptic note he'd left her felt like a dream. Yet the piece of crumpled paper tucked into her bag was very real. She had read his message over and over, but no amount of rereading brought her closer to understanding what it meant. Tomorrow, your life will change. Those words echoed in her mind as she got ready for work, moving through her morning routine in a haze of uncertainty. What could Alex have meant? And more importantly, who was Alex, really? The question lingered as she left her apartment, the chill of the crisp morning air biting at her skin. Melissa decided to take a detour on her way to work. Stopping by the park she often passed but rarely visited. It was a peaceful place, with winding paths and benches overlooking a small pond. She hoped the walk might help clear her mind, maybe even help her make sense of everything that had happened. As she strolled along the path, lost in thought, she noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the water's edge. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Alex, but he looked completely different. Gone was the disheveled, homeless man from the night before. Instead, Alex was clean-shaven, wearing a well-fitted coat and jeans, his hair neatly combed. He sat with an air of quiet confidence, his eyes gazing out over the pond as if he'd been waiting for her. Melissa stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Was this the same man? How could he have transformed so drastically overnight? She hesitated for a moment, her feet rooted to the ground, before finally gathering the courage to approach him. As she neared the bench, Alex turned to look at her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Melissa," he greeted her, his voice calm and steady, as if nothing unusual had happened. Melissa blinked in disbelief, her mind struggling to reconcile the man before her with the one she had met just hours ago. "Alex?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and awe. What's going on? How are you?" Alex chuckled softly, a sound that felt strangely out of place given the mystery that surrounded him. "I owe you an explanation," he said, gesturing for her to sit beside him on the bench. Still bewildered, Melissa slowly sat down, her eyes never leaving his face. An explanation would be good, she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though she could feel her heart racing in her chest. You look completely different. What happened? Alex looked out over the pond for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. You see, I wasn't exactly honest with you last night, he began. I'm not who you think I am. Melissa frowned, her confusion deepening. What do you mean? Who are you? Alex turned to face her, his expression soft but serious. I'm not homeless. I'm not in need of food or shelter, he said, his voice low but clear. I sought you out for a reason. Melissa felt a jolt of surprise. You sought me out? Why? What do you mean? She leaned in, her eyes searching his face for answers. Alex hesitated for a moment, then continued. I've been looking for people like you, people with kind hearts, people who don't just walk past those in need. You invited me to your table when no one else even noticed me. That means something. It means you see beyond the surface, beyond appearances. Melissa's mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. But why would you do that? Why pretend to be homeless, she asked, still grappling with the strangeness of the situation. Alex smiled gently, a glint of warmth in his eyes. Because I needed to know if you would show compassion without expecting anything in return. Most people wouldn't have bothered. But you did. Melissa shook her head, still struggling to comprehend. But what does that have to do with me? Why does it matter? Alex paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her. Your kindness changed more than just my night, Melissa. It showed me that there's still goodness in the world, even when it's hard to see. And in return, I want to help you. Melissa's heart thudded in her chest. Help me? With what? Alex's expression grew serious again. You're at a crossroads in your life, whether you realize it or not, he said softly. The choices you make in the next few days will shape your future. I can't tell you exactly what's coming, but I can tell you this. Don't be afraid. Trust yourself, and trust that you've done the right thing by showing compassion when no one else did. Melissa stared at him, her mind reeling. How do you know that? How do you know about my life? Alex met her gaze, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like wisdom, something beyond the ordinary. I can't explain everything right now, he said, his tone gentle but firm. But I've seen what happens when people like you follow their instincts, when they choose kindness over indifference. It leads them to places they never imagined. Melissa felt a chill run down her spine, not from fear, but from the weight of his words. This sounds, I don't know, like something out of a movie, she said with a half laugh, though there was no humor in her voice. How am I supposed to believe any of this? Alex smiled again, but there was no amusement in his eyes. You don't have to believe me right now, he said softly. Just remember what I've said. When the time comes, you'll understand. Melissa fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wanted to ask more questions, to demand more answers, but something told her that she wasn't going to get them, at least not today. After a long pause, Alex stood up from the bench. Take care, Melissa, he said, his voice kind but final. You're stronger than you think. She watched as he walked away, his figure slowly disappearing down the path. The air felt heavier now, the sounds of the park muted, as if the world had shifted in some invisible way. Melissa sat there for a long time after he was gone, her mind racing with everything he had said. Who was Alex, really? And why did he believe that her life was about to change? As she finally rose from the bench and made her way back toward the city streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, something she couldn't yet understand. But one thing was clear, nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The next few days passed in a blur for Melissa. The encounter with Alex lingered in her mind like a haunting melody, one she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. His words had stuck with her. You're at a crossroads in your life. What did that even mean? Every morning she woke up expecting something to change, but everything felt the same. Her job, her daily routine, her life. But there was something different about how she saw the world. People no longer blended into the background of her busy city life. She noticed them now. The tired cashier at the grocery store, the woman on the bus juggling two kids, the old man sitting alone on the park bench. Melissa felt more attuned to the invisible struggles that everyone seemed to carry, just like Alex had carried his. One rainy afternoon, as she was sitting in her apartment staring at the note Alex had left her, the words swirling in her mind once again, her phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number. "Meet me at the cafe. We need to talk." Her heart raced. Could it be Alex? She hadn't heard from him since that day in the park. Without hesitation, Melissa grabbed her coat and headed out into the city, the rain lightly misting her face as she made her way to the cafe where everything had started. When she arrived, the cafe was quieter than usual, the warm glow from the inside windows casting a cozy light against the gray sky. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. And there, sitting at the same table where they'd first met, was Alex. He looked different again, more relaxed, less guarded. He gave her a small smile as she approached, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "Melissa," he greeted her, his voice warm and familiar. "I'm glad you came." She took a seat, still feeling the strange tension that seemed to follow every encounter with him. "I didn't expect to hear from you again," she admitted, her eyes searching his face for answers. "You said my life was going to change, but nothing's happened." "Not really." Alex chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming with a knowing look. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "Everything has already started to change. You're just not seeing it yet." Melissa frowned, her confusion deepening. "What are you talking about? I feel like I'm still stuck in the same routine." "Think about it," Alex said gently, leaning forward. "Since that night, how have you felt? How have you viewed the people around you? Your world might look the same on the surface, but inside, something's shifted, hasn't it?" Melissa hesitated. She wanted to argue, to say that nothing was different, but deep down, she knew he was right. Something had changed, but it wasn't a dramatic outward transformation. It was more subtle, more internal. She had started to see the world through a different lens, one of compassion, empathy, and connection. "You're seeing people differently, aren't you?" Alex continued, as if reading her thoughts. "You're noticing things you didn't before. That's the beginning of your change." Melissa nodded slowly, her mind piecing it together. "I guess I have. But why? Why did meeting you change that?" Alex smiled softly. "Because you let it. You allowed yourself to see beyond the surface of things. Most people are so focused on their own lives that they don't stop to consider the lives of others. You did, and that's where the real change begins." Melissa leaned back in her chair, the weight of his words settling over her. "So what now?" she asked, unsure of what was expected of her. Alex's expression grew more serious. "Now, you have to decide what you want to do with this new perspective. You've been given a gift, not just by me, but by your own heart. You have the ability to see people for who they truly are, to connect with them on a deeper level. But it's up to you to choose how you use that." Melissa stared at him, her mind racing. "What do you mean? How can I use it?" Alex leaned forward, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "You're at a point in your life where you can make a difference, not just for yourself, but for others. You've always had that ability, but now you're more aware of it. You can choose to walk away from this and return to your old life, or you can take what you've learned and use it to help others." Melissa felt a surge of uncertainty. Help others? But how? "I'm just one person. What difference can I really make?" Alex smiled gently, his eyes filled with a quiet confidence. "That's where you're wrong, Melissa. One person can make all the difference. You already did, just by sitting with me that night. You gave me hope, and that's more powerful than you realize." Melissa felt her throat tighten, her mind flashing back to that evening in the cafe. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, just a simple act of kindness. But now, hearing Alex speak, she realized the profound impact it had had, not just on him, but on her as well. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice soft, almost vulnerable. Alex leaned back, his smile widening. "You live. You go out into the world and keep doing what you're doing. Keep noticing people. Keep showing up. It's not about grand gestures or big changes. It's about the small moments, the connections you make with others. That's how you create a new beginning." Melissa sat in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't about some big, dramatic change. It was about the little things, the everyday acts of kindness and awareness that could shift the course of someone's life, even if just for a moment. "I never expected this," Melissa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was just offering you a seat, and now everything feels different." Alex nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. That's how it works. Sometimes the smallest choices lead to the biggest changes. You made a choice that night, and now you're seeing the ripple effects. Melissa looked at him, her heart full of gratitude and a newfound sense of purpose. Thank you, she said, her voice steady. For everything. Alex smiled, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. No, Melissa, thank you for being one of the few who can see. With that, he stood up, leaving Melissa sitting at the table, her mind buzzing with thoughts and possibilities. As he walked out of the cafe, Melissa knew this would be the last time she saw him. But that was okay. She didn't need to see him again to understand the impact he had made on her life. As the rain continued to fall outside, Melissa felt a sense of clarity wash over her. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came next.